In the next chapter of Rudolf Steiner's Spiritual Hierarchies and the Physical World, we are on chapter 4, The Work of the Spiritual Hierarchies and the Zodiac. So now he begins to talk about the Zodiac and how the Zodiac came into being. This lecture was given April 13th, 1909 in the evening. He recaps a bit and he says that, as we saw, what happened with the epoch of old Saturn is that the beings who in today's hierarchy are the archi, and there's three levels up above the human. It goes angels, archangels, and archi. Those were the beings, the archi, who were human during the Saturn phase. And we have seen that during the Saturn phase, a densification process took place whereby these eggs of warmth came into being. And he says here in this lecture that how these eggs derived their forms was through the thoughts of these beings. They were thinking. Recall previously in the first lecture what he said about the importance of thinking. Thoughts releases spiritual beings. Here these beings were thinking, and as they were thinking, it conferred form, differentiation, form on each of these warmth eggs. But he says, now where did the substance come from? And I was hoping he would address this because in Outline of Esoteric Science, which he writes during the same year, he had said that these beings were created by a sacrifice on the part of an upper hierarchy known as the spirits of will, also known as the thrones. And the spirits of will sacrifice themselves to pour out the substance. Here he says what they do is they pour out the actual substance. In much the same way he says that silkworms spin out their silk to make the substance of the silk. So too here in this case these beings, these higher beings, the thrones, the spirits of will, spin out their substance to provide Saturn with its warmth, its general warmth substance, to which form is then conferred on it by the archi, the spirits of personality, who give it its shape. So we have the Aristotelian opposition of form and matter in union here on Saturn. So he clarifies that aspect. Then he says that the beings in the next phase, on old Sun, where we saw that the warmth, which was dark, densified into gas and also lit up. Just as the temperature of warmth heats up, he says it eventually produces light. So too, the gas is heated up on old Sun to produce light. So it was a brightly lit orb. And the beings who are now human during our phase, or the beings who are now above us as archangels, were human on this phase, the phase of old Sun. It's difficult to keep track sometimes of all of his hierarchies. They were human on old Sun. And he says, so recall this process that he talked about, the process of the exhalation that these beings, when they sort of breathed outward. And here also we should note that the physical body had come into being on Saturn. These eggs of warmth are the earliest origins of the human physical form, whereas here the etheric form is coming into being, though he doesn't address the four subtle bodies in this version of his cosmogony. This would correspond to the etheric body. And as these beings exhale and breathe out, they radiate light out into space. And when they inhale, as we saw, everything becomes dark. And the only thing that's there when it is dark, when they sort of inhale all of this, is these warmth eggs, this darkness and this gaseous warmth stuff. And he says, so what happens is that during this exhalation process, these beings, these archangels, which are also known, he also calls them elsewhere as spirits of fire, which fits their role in the Sun where light is being emanated. What they do when they exhale this light, it would have kept going out into infinite space if another higher hierarchy that's actually above even the thrones or spirits of will, the ones who had sacrificed their substance, above them are the cherubim, also known as the spirits of harmony. He refers to them here as cherubim. Above them, and the cherubim sort of acted almost as a boundary. They gathered around in a ring around this exhalation of light, and they sort of reflected it back. They stopped it from going out into infinite space and reflected it back. And as it reflected back, the seeds of what will later become, as we learned from previous discussions during the Atlantean period, when there were four different human types, the bull types, the lion types, the human types, and the eagle types, those appear amongst the cherubim. And the cherubim are pictured at four different points of the compass here as these four seed forms of what will later become actual animal forms. So we're still in a kind of Platonic realm here. These are the Platonic forms of animal archetypes that now begin to appear to reflect back and stop the exhalation of the light from going out into infinite space. And so now during what happens that's the sun day, it's day aspect, during the sun night aspect, during the nighttime aspect of it, when the inhalation process occurs, and there's only this sort of gaseous, dense, round envelope without any light. These beings, these cherubim, these higher beings, then interact with this gaseous envelope to produce the first seeds of the animal archetypes, the animal forms. And each one of those four, the bull, the lion, the man, and the eagle, then receives two companions, which at each of the four corners, so that we have the 12 signs of the Zodiac, but these are the seeds of the animal forms. He says today's animals, recall, are caricatures of these original animal archetypes. These are sort of the Platonic ideas of the animal forms, and they first appear here during Old Sun as totally separate from the human beings who back in this period were the spirits of fire, the archangels. And so during the nighttime, then the rest of the animal archetypes form, and these become the sort of Platonic forms or archetypes, the origins of what will later be called the Zodiac, but also the origins of the basic animal forms. This is what he says. And so that's the gist of this chapter. But what I want to do for the rest of this discussion is talk for a second about this Zodiac. And he's got a drawing of it, presumably one of his chalkboard drawings, that makes clear kind of what he's saying, where he's talking about, I don't know if you can see this or not, maybe if it's that close, and you can see where you've got the bull in the upper left there, and the lion, and then down below you've got the eagle, and then the man in those four corners with rounded ellipses. And then next to the bull, you can see the ram on one side of it, and the Gemini, the twins, on the other side of it. And then beside Leo, you've got there the crab on one side and Virgo on the other side. And beside the eagle there, you have the scales on one side and the archer on the other. And then finally beside the waterman there, Aquarius, you've got Capricorn on one side, the goat, and then the fishes on the other. Now, what's interesting about this is that Steiner has this point where he talks about, in the ancient world, names were not given to things arbitrarily. Names captured the essences of things. So this postmodern idea that all language is just totally signifiers, the signifier, according to Saussure, has an arbitrary relationship to its signified, is incorrect. That's only true of modernity. That's only true of the modern world. In the ancient world, names captured the seeds and essences of things, and things were not named arbitrarily. So he says here that later he'll say of the planets Mercury and Venus that the two names have been switched, actually. They were originally the opposite names. Today, what is called Mercury was originally called Venus, and vice versa. So those names have slipped. The astrologer Rick Tarnas has written a monograph on Uranus, the planet Uranus, which has the same problem. Steiner says here in this passage that when astronomers discover a new star, they simply get out their dictionaries of Greek myth and flip through it randomly and find a name that hasn't been used yet, so that these names are random. Uranus suffered this fate because Uranus was misnamed, according to Tarnas, and should be Prometheus, because Uranus is the planet that is associated with breakthroughs, with sudden revolutions. It's also, in its negative aspect, it's associated with instability and destabilizing things. But in its positive aspect, it's the breakthrough. It's the planet of breakthroughs, which is why individuals when Uranus comes halfway around, it takes 84 years to go around the sun for our Uranus return on its halfway mark at 42. So many great thinkers produce their greatest works at the age of 40. And there's an orb in astrology of effect it would come into effect around the age of 38-ish and last as long as 42, 43, even 44. It has a very wide orb because it's so powerful. And then again, on its return at 84 years, there's another breakthrough there. So Uranus has been misnamed. And also, he says here, that notice that the Scorpio in Steiner's diagram is the eagle, which is what it is in the tetramorph that goes all the way down to being associated with the four evangelists. Why is it an eagle? Later he'll tell us, but he says that later the eagle becomes renamed Scorpio. So it becomes renamed, even though it's still the same constellation. But notice that the constellation of Libra, which is right beside it here, which is called the scales, actually originally were the claws. They weren't scales. They were originally claws. I know this from studying astrological history. The signs have changed. The pictures of them have changed, and the names have changed. And the scales were originally the claws of Scorpio. Then the rest of the beast. Actually, it was one constellation there, and then it got separated into two separate constellations, Libra on the one hand and Scorpio on the other. But that wasn't the case originally. If you look at, as I've gone through the Gilgamesh epic, and my theory about Gilgamesh is that he is transiting through the 12 signs of the Zodiac, but in order to see that and figure it out, you have to know what the original Mesopotamian images were. And indeed, the bull was the same, Leo was the same, the twins were the same, and the water bearer, Aquarius, Utnapishtim, who later becomes Noah, was also the same. So those four basic signs that Steiner is talking about here as part of the cherubim beings did not change, and they're all in the Gilgamesh epic quite clearly. The other signs are tricky because Cancer for them was not a crab. It was called the carpenter, and it turns out that Enkidu has carpenterial skills, so he is linked with that sign, with this sign of Cancer, which at that time would have been the solstice for the point that the sun would have been in during that precessional epoch, which was the epoch of Taurus, would have corresponded to Cancer as the summer solstice. So there's that, and the signs that are associated with the goat fish was still the same. That later becomes the god. That was the god Enki, who had both the goat and the fish sacred to him. And then Aquarius is the same, but the Pisces fishes were not the same. They were the tail of the swallow, which is why Noah, once the ark comes to rest, sends out these birds. Originally, in the Gilgamesh epic, when Utnapishtim's ark comes to rest, he sends out a swallow specifically, and the boat is in the shape of a cube because it represents the Iku square, which is a square that's located in between the two Pisces fish, called one Iku, and which was an area of measurement for the Babylonians. But that's why the ark is in the shape of a cube. And that puzzled me forever, trying to figure out why a boat would be in the shape of a cube. It's because it's an astronomical symbol. And also, the other fish was symbolized by the goddess Belit Eli. So they weren't fish. And the goddess Belit Eli is indeed there in the Gilgamesh epic, in that final climactic scene when Utnapishtim describes the flood. Ares was not depicted as a ram. Ares was known as the day laborer, the man who you hired for daily work, daily pay, and was depicted as a single palm tree with two individuals, one on either side of it. These would undoubtedly have been day laborers who would climb palm trees. I grew up in Phoenix, which is loaded with palm trees, and I have seen these guys do this. They have to climb up periodically to shear off all the excess dead fronds. As the fronds hang out and die, they become these brittle leaves that create this extra sort of exoskeleton of dead palm leaves that, if you don't shave them off, can harvest black widows and scorpions and birds nesting in there. All sorts of nasty creatures get in there if they're not normally trimmed. And so Ares, which we see as a ram with the two horns curling out, was originally this palm tree with the two laborers going up it. So the signs have changed. Steiner doesn't take that into account here as far as the pictures of the signs go, but he does say that some of the names were different. The eagle gets renamed as Scorpio, for instance, and those two planets. We'll get into the discussion of how and why Mercury and Venus's names were switched. So interesting. So that's chapter 4 in the spiritual hierarchies. Next, we'll look at chapter 5.